It's the summer of 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific. A young Japanese soldier lies on a field hospital cot, his leg shattered by shrapnel. He's certain he's about to die, not from his wounds, but from what he believes will come next. He's been told since basic training that American soldiers show no mercy, that capture means torture and execution. His commanders drilled it into every man, death before dishonor, because surrender means unspeakable suffering. But then something happens that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Something that contradicts everything he was taught to believe about his enemy. An American doctor approaches. The Japanese soldier tenses, waiting for the end. Instead, the doctor kneels beside him, examines his wound with the same careful attention he might give to one of his own men, and begins treatment. Not after treating the American wounded. Not as an afterthought. But now. Immediately. With the same urgency and skill he would apply to any soldier under his care. The Japanese soldier's eyes widen in disbelief. All around him, he can see other enemy wounded receiving the same treatment. Some American soldiers with serious injuries lie waiting on adjacent cots. Yet the doctors move between Japanese and American wounded without distinction, treating whoever needs help most urgently, regardless of which flag they fought under just hours before. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't what he'd been told about the enemy. And for many Japanese prisoners of war throughout the Pacific Theater, this moment of medical care would become the most confusing, profound, and transformative experience of the entire war. This is one of the most overlooked stories of World War II. A story that reveals something fundamental about the difference between what soldiers are told about their enemies and what sometimes happens when the shooting stops. This is a story about the Geneva Convention in action, about medical ethics under the most extreme circumstances, and about how a simple act of treating wounded enemy soldiers according to international law became a powerful weapon in a psychological war that neither side fully understood. The story matters because it exposes a crack in the edifice of propaganda that sustained the Japanese war effort. It matters because it shows how American adherence to medical ethics wasn't just morally right. It had strategic consequences that rippled through prisoner of war camps and eventually back to the Japanese home islands. And it matters because it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are moments when our better nature prevails, often in the most unexpected ways. But to understand why treating enemy wounded was so shocking to Japanese soldiers, we need to understand what they'd been told to expect, and why the Japanese military went to such extraordinary lengths to prevent their men from being captured alive. The Japanese military indoctrination regarding capture was unlike anything seen in Western armies. From the moment a recruit entered training, he was taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, not just to himself, but to his family, his ancestors, and the emperor. The Japanese Army's Field Service Code, issued in 1941, explicitly stated that soldiers should never suffer the shame of being taken alive. Death was preferable to capture under any circumstances. But the indoctrination went far beyond simply discouraging surrender. Japanese soldiers were systematically taught that if they were captured, they would face torture, mutilation, and execution at the hands of American forces. This wasn't presented as possibility, it was taught as certainty. The propaganda was specific and horrifying. Soldiers were told that Americans would cut off their fingers one by one, gouge out their eyes, and subject them to unimaginable brutalities before finally killing them. Why such extreme propaganda? The Japanese High Command understood something about modern warfare that made them deeply uncomfortable. As the war progressed and Japanese forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive, the possibility of mass surrenders became very real. The military leadership knew that if soldiers believed they might be treated humanely as prisoners, they might choose survival over suicidal last stands. And the Japanese military strategy, particularly in the later stages of the war, depended heavily on soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrendering strategic positions. There was also a cultural element at play. The concept of Bushido, the samurai code, had been weaponized and distorted by the military to create an ideology where death in battle was the only honorable outcome. But this was a modern invention, a militaristic interpretation of older traditions twisted to serve the needs of total war. Traditional Bushido had been far more nuanced, but that complexity didn't serve the purposes of the Japanese war machine. The result was a military force where surrender rates were extraordinarily low compared to other armies in World War II. While soldiers from European armies might surrender when their tactical situation became hopeless, Japanese soldiers would often fight until killed or wounded into unconsciousness. The few who did surrender often did so only after being wounded so severely that they couldn't resist, or after suffering injuries that left them temporarily unconscious, allowing them to rationalize that they hadn't technically surrendered at all. This created a unique problem for American forces. The soldiers they captured were often in terrible physical condition, having fought far longer than would be typical for soldiers from other nations. Many Japanese prisoners arrived at field hospitals barely alive, with wounds that had gone untreated for hours or even days because seeking help would have meant accepting capture. Dr. Paul Stratt, a battalion surgeon with the 1st Marine Division, later recalled the condition of the first Japanese prisoners he treated after the Battle of Guadalcanal. "I've never seen men cling to life so desperately while simultaneously seeming surprised that they were still alive," he wrote in his memoir. "They would watch us with this mixture of terror and confusion. Some would close their eyes when we approached, as if waiting for the killing blow." The American Military Medical Corps faced a straightforward but challenging mandate: treat all wounded according to the Geneva Convention, which required that enemy wounded receive the same level of care as friendly forces. The convention was clear: medical treatment must be provided based on medical need, not based on which uniform the patient wore. The most seriously wounded, whether friend or foe, received treatment first. This wasn't just an idealistic principle. It was binding international law that the United States had committed to uphold. Army medical officers were explicitly trained that failing to treat enemy wounded could constitute a war crime. Medical personnel were reminded repeatedly that their oath to do no harm didn't come with nationality clauses. But applying this principle in the field, when American soldiers with serious wounds might have to wait while doctors treated enemy soldiers whose comrades had just killed their friends, required extraordinary discipline and commitment to professional ethics. The temptation to prioritize treating one's own forces first must have been enormous. Yet across the Pacific Theater, American medical personnel largely upheld their obligations under international law. What they couldn't have known was that this adherence to medical ethics would have consequences far beyond the immediate humanitarian concerns. Every Japanese soldier who received medical treatment before expecting execution became, in effect, a witness to the gap between what his own propaganda had told him and what actually happened. And in a war where propaganda and belief sustained both sides, these witnesses would eventually become a problem for the Japanese military establishment. The first encounter between a Japanese prisoner and American medical care typically followed a pattern. The prisoner would be brought to a field hospital or aid station, often semi-conscious or in severe pain. When he realized where he was, in the hands of the enemy, his first reaction was usually terror. Many prisoners would begin trembling, some would close their eyes and turn their heads away, waiting for what they believed was inevitable. Then the examination would begin. An American doctor or medic would assess the wounds, determine the severity, and begin treatment. No interrogation. No violence. Just medicine. The psychological impact on Japanese prisoners was profound and immediate. Imagine having spent your entire military service being told that the enemy is subhuman, that they will torture you, that capture means a fate worse than death, and then experiencing the exact opposite. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Corporal Hajime Kondo, captured on Saipan in 1944, later described his experience. "I had closed my eyes and was waiting to die. I felt hands on my arm. I thought they were tying me down for torture. Then I felt the morphine take effect. I opened my eyes and saw the American doctor bandaging my leg where the shrapnel had torn through. He worked carefully, talking to another medic about the wound, completely professional. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the same tone as our own medical officers. In that moment, everything I had been told began to crumble. The shock was compounded when prisoners observed American doctors treating enemy wounded before treating their own men. This went against everything in their understanding of military hierarchy and loyalty. In the Japanese military, the needs of the collective, especially the needs of the emperor's forces, always superseded individual welfare. The idea that an American doctor would make decisions based purely on medical need, treating a seriously wounded enemy soldier before a less seriously wounded American, seemed to defy logic. But this is exactly what happened over and over throughout the Pacific War. At Tarawa, American medical personnel treated Japanese wounded throughout the night after the battle, even as their own wounded continued to arrive. On Iwo Jima, where the fighting was particularly brutal and casualties were staggering on both sides, medical officers adhered to triage protocols that made no distinction based on nationality. Dr. James Vetter, who served as a surgeon in the Navy Medical Corps, wrote about a particularly difficult decision he faced on Iwo Jima. We had a young Marine with severe abdominal wounds and a Japanese soldier with a severed femoral artery. Both needed immediate surgery. The Marine was one of our own, barely 20 years old. I could see his buddies watching, waiting to see what I would do. But the Japanese soldier would die within minutes without immediate intervention, while the Marine, though seriously wounded, could wait 30 minutes. I operated on the Japanese soldier first. Some of the Marines didn't understand, but my chief corpsman did. He told the others, "That's why we're different from them. That's why we're going to win." This incident reveals something crucial about the American approach. It wasn't just about following rules, it was about what those rules represented. American medical personnel saw their adherence to the Geneva Convention as a demonstration of the values they were fighting for. Treating enemy wounded fairly wasn't weakness, it was proof of moral superiority. The Japanese prisoners, meanwhile, struggled to process what they were experiencing. Some initially believed it was a trick, that they were being kept alive for interrogation and torture later. But as days passed and they continued to receive care, proper food, pain medication, treatment for infections, even surgery when necessary, this explanation became harder to maintain. The American medical approach also included a level of personal interaction that surprised Japanese prisoners. Doctors and medics would often try to communicate, using hand gestures and the few Japanese words they'd picked up. They would show concern for their patients' comfort, adjusting pillows, offering water, checking on pain levels. These small, human interactions cut through the propaganda in ways that larger gestures might not have. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who fought with the 1st Marine Division and later wrote a memoir of his experiences, observed the transformation in Japanese prisoners after they received medical treatment. You could see it in their faces. When they first arrived, they were terrified, some almost catatonic. After a few hours in the medical tent, after the doctors had worked on them and the morphine had taken effect, something would change. They'd start to relax, even make eye contact. It was like watching someone wake up from a nightmare and realize it was just a dream. But not every American soldier understood or approved of treating enemy wounded with such care. The hatred between American and Japanese forces in the Pacific was intense, fueled by brutal combat, atrocities on both sides, and racial prejudice. Some American soldiers questioned why medical resources should be wasted on the enemy. There were incidents where wounded Japanese soldiers were shot rather than captured, where prisoners were mistreated or killed. Yet the official policy remained clear, and by and large, medical personnel upheld it. The Army and Navy Medical Corps maintained strict professional standards, and commanding officers generally supported their medical officers in providing proper care to prisoners. There were several reasons for this beyond simple adherence to international law. First, there was reciprocity. American military leadership hoped that by treating Japanese prisoners properly, they might encourage better treatment of American prisoners held by Japan. This hope proved largely unfounded. Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners remained horrific throughout the war, but the principle still guided American policy. Second, there was intelligence value. Prisoners who had been treated well were more likely to provide useful information. While outright interrogation was separate from medical care, the goodwill generated by proper treatment made intelligence gathering easier. Third, there was the morale factor. Many American commanders understood that maintaining discipline and adherence to the rules of war was essential for their own forces. Once you start ignoring the Geneva Convention, where do you stop? How do you maintain moral authority and discipline among your own troops? But perhaps most importantly, there was the recognition that how you treat the helpless, including helpless enemies, says something fundamental about who you are. This was a war against fascism, against an ideology that devalued human life and glorified military might above all else. How could America claim moral superiority if it abandoned its own principles when they became inconvenient? The conflict, then, wasn't just between American and Japanese forces. It was between competing visions of what military service meant, what obligations soldiers owed to each other and to the helpless, and what values were worth fighting for. Every time an American doctor treated a Japanese prisoner's wounds before treating an American soldier's less serious injuries, this deeper conflict was playing out in a hospital tent somewhere in the Pacific. The immediate outcome of this policy was straightforward. Thousands of Japanese soldiers who expected to die instead survived and recovered. By the end of the war, the United States held approximately 35,000 Japanese prisoners of war, a remarkably low number considering the scale of the Pacific Campaign. But each of these prisoners had experienced something that contradicted fundamental assumptions about the enemy. The survival rate of Japanese prisoners in American custody was extraordinarily high compared to the survival rate of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands. While approximately 27% of Allied prisoners held by Japan died in captivity, one of the highest mortality rates of any combatant nation in World War II, the death rate of Japanese prisoners in American custody was less than 3%, primarily due to wounds received before capture or illnesses contracted in the field. This disparity wasn't lost on the prisoners themselves. As they recovered in POW camps, Japanese prisoners began comparing notes about their treatment. The consistency of the experience, good medical care, adequate food, humane treatment, made it impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or temporary deception. This was clearly official policy, consistently applied. The strategic impact of this humane treatment took time to reveal itself, but it was significant. As the war progressed, American forces began to notice that surrender rates among Japanese troops, while still low by Western standards, were slowly increasing. More importantly, the circumstances of surrender were changing. Instead of only wounded or unconscious soldiers being captured, some Japanese troops began actively choosing surrender when their situations became hopeless. This shift was partly due to the deteriorating Japanese military situation by 1944 and 45. Soldiers were increasingly cut off from supplies, starving, and aware that the war was lost. But intelligence officers noted that rumors about American treatment of prisoners had begun to circulate among Japanese forces. Despite the Japanese military's best efforts to prevent communication with prisoners and suppress information about their treatment, word was getting out. Some of this communication happened through captured documents and diaries. When American forces overran Japanese positions, they would find letters and diary entries from soldiers who mentioned hearing rumors about Japanese prisoners being treated well by the Americans. The Japanese High Command took these rumors seriously enough that they increased efforts to prevent soldiers from surrendering, even issuing orders that officers should shoot their own men rather than allow them to be captured alive. The most dramatic evidence of the policy's impact came during the final months of the war, particularly on Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945, saw the largest number of Japanese military surrenders of any Pacific battle. Over 7,000 prisoners taken. This was partly due to the presence of Okinawan civilians, whose suffering made some Japanese soldiers question the value of fighting to the death. But it was also due to leaflets dropped by American forces that explicitly promised medical treatment and humane conditions for those who surrendered. These leaflets worked, in part, because they were credible. Enough stories about actual American treatment of prisoners had filtered through the Japanese military that soldiers could believe the promises being made. If the United States had mistreated Japanese prisoners, these leaflets would have been useless propaganda. Instead, they became effective psychological warfare tools precisely because they were truthful. Lieutenant Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army on Okinawa, later wrote about the dilemma facing Japanese forces. We knew that soldiers who surrendered to the Americans were being treated according to international law. This knowledge undermined our indoctrination efforts. Some officers argued that we should inform the troops that American treatment was a trick, that prisoners would eventually be killed. But too many men had heard otherwise from reliable sources. The truth was working against us. The broader military impact extended beyond surrender rates. Every Japanese prisoner who survived became a source of intelligence about troop movements, defensive preparations, morale, and strategic plans. While most prisoners remained reluctant to provide information, the fact that they were alive, recovered from their wounds, and in reasonably good health made intelligence gathering possible. Some prisoners, particularly those who had become disillusioned with the Japanese military leadership, provided valuable information that helped save American lives. There was also a post-war impact that couldn't have been anticipated during the fighting. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the United States faced the enormous challenge of occupying and rebuilding Japan. The fact that thousands of Japanese soldiers had experienced humane treatment as prisoners of war became a small but significant factor in the relatively peaceful occupation that followed. Many former prisoners became advocates for cooperation with American occupation forces. They had seen firsthand that Americans were not the demons their propaganda had portrayed. While the Japanese population as a whole was devastated and exhausted by the war, making resistance unlikely under any circumstances, the testimony of former prisoners helped establish that Americans could be dealt with honorably. Corporal Kondo, the former prisoner from Saipan who was shocked by his medical treatment, returned to Japan after the war and became a teacher. He spoke openly about his experiences as a prisoner, telling his students, "I learned that we had been lied to about our enemies. Not by people who were mistaken, but by those who knew they were lying. The American doctor who saved my leg when I expected to die taught me that what matters is not which flag you serve, but whether you honor your obligations to other human beings. It's a lesson I wish we had learned before the war, not during it." The statistical impact tells part of the story, but the human impact is harder to quantify. How many Japanese soldiers chose to surrender rather than fight to the death because they had heard that Americans treated prisoners humanely? How many lives, both American and Japanese, were saved because medical ethics were consistently applied? We can't know the exact numbers, but the historical evidence suggests the impact was real and meaningful. The story of American medical treatment of Japanese prisoners reveals something essential about the nature of warfare and human rights in the 20th century. It represents a moment when international law, specifically the Geneva Convention, was tested under the most difficult circumstances imaginable and largely upheld. This wasn't guaranteed. The Pacific War was characterized by exceptional brutality, racial hatred, and mutual atrocities. It would have been easy to rationalize abandoning the rules of war. Yet American medical personnel, supported by military leadership, chose to honor their obligations under international law. This choice had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate medical care provided. It influenced surrender rates, generated valuable intelligence, facilitated post-war occupation, and stood as evidence of American commitment to its stated values. But the story also reveals the limits of moral action in warfare. While American medical personnel treated Japanese prisoners humanely, the broader conduct of the Pacific War included atrocities on both sides. American soldiers sometimes killed prisoners, particularly in the heat of battle. The firebombing of Japanese cities and the use of atomic weapons killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The humane treatment of prisoners, while significant, existed within a context of total war where civilian casualties were accepted as inevitable. This paradox, the coexistence of medical ethics and mass violence, tells us something important about how modern societies wage war. We create rules and conventions designed to limit warfare's horrors, to preserve some measure of humanity even in the midst of organized killing. The Geneva Convention represents an attempt to say, even in war, there are boundaries. Even enemies retain certain rights. Even in the most extreme circumstances, certain principles must be upheld. The American adherence to these principles in treating Japanese prisoners wasn't perfect, but it was substantial enough to matter. And it mattered not just morally, but practically. The Japanese military's propaganda campaign depended on convincing soldiers that capture meant torture and death. Every prisoner who survived to testify otherwise undermined that propaganda. The truth became a weapon more powerful than any lie. There's a deeper lesson here about the relationship between means and ends in warfare. The United States was fighting to defeat Japanese militarism and imperialism. But if America had achieved that goal by abandoning its own principles, by torturing prisoners, by ignoring international law, by treating enemy wounded as expendable, what would that victory have meant? At what point does the corruption of means corrupt the ends themselves? The doctors and medics who treated Japanese prisoners probably weren't thinking in these grand terms. They were following their training, honoring their oaths, and doing their jobs under difficult circumstances. But their collective actions represented something larger, a commitment to the idea that some principles transcend the immediate demands of military necessity. This story was largely overlooked in the decades after World War II for several reasons. First, the sheer scale of the war's other events, the Holocaust, the atomic bombs, the massive casualties, overshadowed quieter stories of medical ethics. Second, American popular memory of the Pacific War focused on heroic combat actions, not on the treatment of prisoners. Third, the Japanese prisoners themselves often remained silent about their experiences, given the stigma of capture in Japanese society. But the story deserves to be remembered because it shows that moral choices matter even in, especially in, the most morally complex situations. War doesn't suspend ethics, it tests them. The American medical personnel who treated enemy wounded before their own soldiers in less urgent need weren't being naive idealists. They were upholding a standard that, in the long run, served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. The legacy extends beyond World War II. The principles demonstrated in the Pacific Theater, that enemy wounded deserve medical care, that treatment decisions should be based on medical need rather than nationality, that adherence to international law serves important purposes, continue to guide military medical practice today. Every time a military doctor treats an enemy combatant, every time medical triage is conducted without regard to which side the patient fought for, the legacy of those World War II medical personnel endures. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis are individual human beings whose lives intersected in field hospitals and POW camps across the Pacific. Dr. Thomas Hewlett was a young surgeon from Iowa who served with the Navy Medical Corps. At Peleliu, he faced a situation that would haunt him for years. An American Marine with a chest wound arrived at the same moment as a Japanese soldier with a nearly severed arm. Both needed immediate surgery. The Japanese soldier would bleed out in minutes without intervention, Hewlett recalled years later. The Marine, while seriously wounded, could wait 30 minutes. I operated on the Japanese soldier first. I remember the look on the faces of the Marines who had brought their buddy in. They didn't say anything, but I could see the question in their eyes. Why are you saving the enemy first? After the surgery, Hewlett's chief corpsman sat down next to those Marines and explained it to them. He said, "The doc had to make a choice based on who needed help most urgently. That's what we do. That's what separates us from them. The Japs tell their soldiers we're barbarians who'll torture and kill prisoners. Every time we prove that's a lie, we're winning a different kind of battle." The Japanese soldier Hewlett operated on eventually recovered and was transferred to a prisoner camp in Hawaii. Years later, Hewlett learned that the man had survived the war and returned to Japan, where he became a physician himself, working in a rural clinic. The two men never met, but Hewlett kept a photograph of the soldier's medical record in his desk drawer until his death in 2004. Then there was Sergeant Frank Muller, a medic who spoke some Japanese, having grown up in Hawaii. At Saipan, he helped treat Japanese wounded because he could communicate with them. "The first Japanese soldier I treated looked at me with such pure terror that it shocked me," Muller remembered. "He was shaking so badly I could barely take his pulse. So I started talking to him in Japanese, just explaining what the doctor was doing, telling him he would be okay. The look of surprise on his face when he realized I could speak his language was something I'll never forget." From the Japanese side, Lieutenant Yasuo Kuwahara was shot down off the coast of Iwo Jima and rescued by an American destroyer. He expected execution. Instead, he was taken to the ship's medical bay, where a Navy doctor treated his burns and broken collarbone. "I had been taught that death was preferable to capture," Kuwahara wrote in his post-war memoir. "I expected the end would come quickly. Instead, I received morphine for pain. The doctor worked on my injuries with the same care my own medical officers would have shown. Everything I believed about the enemy began to unravel in that moment." Kuwahara spent the war in a POW camp in California. He later reflected that the hardest part wasn't the imprisonment. It was the knowledge that they had been systematically lied to. If the Americans weren't the demons we'd been told about, what else was untrue? Were the reasons we were given for the war honest? These questions were more painful than my physical injuries. These personal stories reveal the human dimension of the larger policy. Behind every statistic were individuals making choices that affirmed human dignity in the midst of war's dehumanizing horror. We began this story with a young Japanese soldier lying on a cot, waiting for death, and instead receiving medical care that contradicted everything he'd been taught about his enemy. That moment, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater, represents a fundamental choice about what kind of people we want to be, even in war's darkest hours. The doctors and medics who treated Japanese prisoners before American soldiers weren't making a political statement. They were following the Geneva Convention, honoring their professional oaths, and applying medical triage as they'd been trained. But their actions had consequences that reached far beyond immediate medical care. Every prisoner who survived became living evidence that the propaganda was false. Every successful surgery undermined the Japanese military's narrative about American brutality. This is the power of consistent ethical action. It doesn't always change outcomes immediately. It doesn't guarantee reciprocity. The Japanese military continued to mistreat Allied prisoners horrifically, regardless of how well Japanese prisoners were treated in American hands. But ethical action matters anyway, because it defines who we are through our deeds when the choice is hard. The American medical personnel who upheld the Geneva Convention weren't naive about the enemy they faced. They knew about the atrocities, the Bataan Death March, the brutal treatment of prisoners. They treated enemy wounded anyway, not because they were unaware, but because they understood that moral principles don't depend on the other side's behavior. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond World War II. In every conflict, there's temptation to abandon ethical principles because the enemy has done so. This logic is seductive because it offers the comfort of moral equivalence. If everyone is doing wrong, then no one is truly guilty. But the American medical personnel in the Pacific rejected that logic. They understood that how you treat the helpless, even helpless enemies, says something fundamental about who you are. The Japanese soldier with a shattered leg, lying unconscious in a field hospital, poses no threat. At that moment, he's not an enemy combatant. He's a wounded human being who needs medical care. How you respond to that need reveals your character. The story reminds us that truth is more powerful than propaganda, but only if actions align with words. The United States could claim moral superiority over Japanese militarism because American actions, while far from perfect, generally aligned with stated values. The humane treatment of prisoners wasn't just a gesture. It was proof that American claims about fighting for freedom and human dignity had substance. Today, as we remember the Pacific War, we tend to focus on the great battles, the strategic decisions, and the atomic bombings that ended the conflict. But we should also remember the quieter story of the doctors and medics who treated enemy wounded, sometimes before treating their own forces, because doing so was right. Their story reminds us that war doesn't suspend our obligation to each other as human beings. It tests that obligation, makes it harder to fulfill, presents situations where violating it might seem justified. But the obligation remains. How we respond, whether we uphold our principles or abandon them when inconvenient, defines us in ways that battlefield victories never can. The Japanese prisoners who were shocked to receive medical treatment returned home after the war carrying a truth their military had tried desperately to suppress, that the enemy was human too, that Americans could show mercy, that the propaganda was false. Some kept this knowledge private, unable to discuss it in a society where capture remained shameful. Others spoke about it, teaching a new generation about questioning official narratives and recognizing shared humanity even across enemy lines. This story is about a choice made thousands of times by thousands of individuals in field hospitals across the Pacific. The choice to treat the wounded based on medical need rather than nationality. The choice to honor professional obligations even when emotionally difficult. The choice to uphold international law even when the enemy did not reciprocate. These choices mattered. They saved lives. They gathered intelligence. They facilitated post-war reconciliation. They stood as evidence of American values. Most importantly, these choices affirmed something essential about human dignity, that it doesn't depend on which uniform you wear or which flag you serve. That even in war, some principles transcend the immediate demands of victory. That how we treat those who are helpless in our hands reveals who we truly are. The young Japanese soldier who received medical care when he expected execution learned this lesson. So did thousands of others. And so should we. The doctors and medics of the Pacific War made their choice. They chose to uphold their principles, to treat the wounded regardless of nationality, to demonstrate that American ideals had substance. Their choice echoes across the decades, reminding us that moral courage sometimes looks like a doctor kneeling beside an enemy soldier, examining his wounds with professional care, and choosing to treat him first because his need is most urgent. That moment, surprising, confusing, and transformative for those who experienced it, represents humanity at its best, even in the midst of humanity's worst. We remember this story not to celebrate war, but to honor those who maintained their humanity within it. We remember it because it shows us what's possible when principles are upheld under the most difficult circumstances. And we remember it because every generation needs reminders that how we treat the helpless, even helpless enemies, defines us in ways that outlast any battlefield victory. The young Japanese soldier lying on that cot expected death and received healing. That moment of unexpected mercy echoed through his life and through history. It's a moment worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth learning from. Because in the end, it reminds us that we're always capable of choosing to be better than our worst impulses, even when war tempts us to be less than we should be.